Good morning. Today's lecture is the Jacksonian Market Revolution. We're building on my lecture from the other day, The Age of Jackson. And so in this period of Andrew Jackson's presidency, which covers more than his presidency because he had such a great influence on those who came after him to the presidency of the United States and such a great impact on the country. So the Jacksonian Market Revolution. In the summer of 1844, writer Nathaniel Hawthorne recorded a disruption as he tried to commune with nature in a grove of woods known as Sleepy Hollow. He wrote, "But hark! There is the whistle of the locomotive, the long shriek, harsh above all other harshness. It tells a story of busy men, men of business, of all unquietness. And no wonder that it gives such a startling shriek, since it brings the noisy world into the midst of our slumbering peace." By the 1820s, it was becoming clear that the American people would leap across limits of every kind. They were optimistic, expansionistic, believing that God had given them the right to pursue happiness and wealth in a land of plenty. This absence of barriers, of distinctions of class, of determined destinies, so common in Europe, was what the great social critic Alexis de Tocqueville had in mind when he described the Americans as having a general condition of equality, a general condition of equality. This is relative to Europeans. It does not mean that Americans were completely equal in every way, by no means. But compared to Europeans, there is a general equality of condition. And de Tocqueville considered this fact to be the basic idea of American society. The Jacksonians were determined to improve upon the equality they already had, to make it better. The chief method for pursuing equality was to remove government favors for the rich, as I explained in my first lecture. And the government favors for the rich during Jackson's presidency were, of course, the Bank of the United States and the tariff, etc. And the idea was to take away these government favors from the rich so that everyone would basically compete on a level playing field. Now, it wasn't perfectly level, but it was more level than other places in the world. Jacksonians believed the right policy for the federal government then was to let free competition in the marketplace regulate the economy, determine the winners and losers in American life. These free enterprise policies opened the way for a host of aspiring entrepreneurs to replace the previously established colonial elites, the upper classes, to replace them with a new order of free enterprise capitalism. This then is one of the great themes of American history, of the Jacksonian period, the rise of free enterprise capitalism. The economy of the southern states. The Industrial Revolution in England created a rapidly growing market for cotton. Cotton had not always been the staple crop of the South. Tobacco, even rice were more important at various times. But in the 19th century, with the creation of Eli Whitney's cotton engine, cotton gin for short, This allowed American cotton farmers to produce cotton at a dramatically lower cost, thus making cotton cloth popular among even very poor people. All one had to do now was to find the labor to produce the cotton, because the processing through the cotton engine was so much more economical than it had been. Previous to the cotton gin, cotton was a cloth of the upper classes. No one else could afford it. Obviously, the South, of course, had the labor in the form of its slaves. Thus, the Industrial Revolution and the cotton gin transformed an entire region of the United States, both economically and socially. You see, at the time of the Founding Fathers, before the turn of the century, the Founding Fathers believed that slavery was going to gradually die, but they did not anticipate the creation of this technology, the cotton gin, and then the rise of the importance of slavery in the cotton economy. And so instead of fading away, slavery became even more important to Southerners. The South became dependent upon a market for a cash crop, cotton, and upon the slave labor system to grow that crop. From the 1830s to 1860, Southern cotton accounted for more than half of the exports of the United States. And slavery, sadly, became figuratively and literally the backbone of the Southern economy. Now, the economy of the West, I'm not talking about the Western states as you and I reckon them, California, Oregon, Washington, etc., but the old West, the west of the Mississippi Valley. In fact, the West at that time was considered those eastern areas, east of the Mississippi Valley, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, as Southerners moved west to find new lands for their great crop, cotton, their actions were mirrored in the North as pioneers pushed into the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River runs roughly from the east to the west, a little bit to the southwest, and then it flows into the Mississippi River. Observing this migration of Northerners down the Ohio River, one observer said, "Old America seems to be breaking up and moving westward. Stagecoaches, light wagons, riders on horseback made up a scene of bustle and business extending over 300 miles. By 1860, the eve of the Civil War, more than half of the nation's population lived in the Trans-Appalachian West, across the Appalachian Mountains. They lived in the Old Northwest. Now again, not the Pacific Northwest, but the Northwest of that period. These are the states, or would-be states, of Michigan and Ohio and Illinois and so forth, eventually. And these states, areas have tremendously fertile lands underneath the forest that had been there for millennia. And so these fertile lands drew farmers from the East Coast into the Old Northwest, as it was called. And then a new land law passed in 1820 reduced the price of federal land. The federal government owns land in this area of the country to $1.25 an acre. And then they cut the minimum purchase to 80 acres. So a man could buy a farm for about $100. And that money oftentimes would be loaned by a bank. The process of settlement followed the old pattern, familiar to people, again, over millennia. Clearing the trees, making the log cabin out of much of those trees, and then, of course, using down trees for firewood as well, and fences and such. Then you grub out the stumps. This is back-breaking work, taking out the underbrush. And you have to do this while trying to get a crop into the ground, some of the clear ground, as soon as possible. Your existence on this new land for a year, 2, maybe even 3, is pretty miserable. It's a tough life. But once you get the farm established, Well, that's what made it all worthwhile. The development of the iron plow eased the labor. And then in 1837, John Deere, yes, John Deere tractors. John Deere invented a steel plow. Steel was both lighter than iron and also stronger, so it didn't break when your mule or your oxen pulled it into a submerged rock. The steel plow was a godsend to farmers. Makes it easier to plow a piece of land. By the 1840s, some farmers had Cyrus McCormick's reaper. There's a great picture of an old-fashioned reaper. The reaper was a significant development for those who were growing wheat or other grains. It was as significant for wheat farmers and such in the north as the cotton gin was for farmers in the south. With a handheld scythe, you know, the old-fashioned scythe that you used to cut down the grain, 2 farmers could harvest 1 acre in a day. But with a McCormick's reaper, 2 men could harvest 12 acres in a day. Enormous increase in productivity. That's what technology is all about, even to this day, is the increase in productivity. What a single person can do with their time and effort. By the 1850s, farming had become a business. Most farmers, north and south, were growing cash crops. They were growing a crop not primarily to consume themselves, but to sell on the market, a cash crop. And as the volume of crops rose, so too did farm incomes and farm living standards. Before the 19th century, for the vast majority of farmers, they are not growing cash crops, they are subsistence farmers. So here's the essential distinction between a cash crop farmer that became the norm in the 19th century and is the norm today, and subsistence farming, where what you're growing is largely consumed by yourself. So you're trying to grow everything and produce everything that a family would need on a farm, a family farm. But that kind of farming now is giving away in the 19th century to cash crops. There had always been some degree of cash crops, especially for farmers in an area of a larger city or town, where they would take some of their products to market and sell, say, on a Saturday market kind of situation. But by and large, in the 18th century and before, farmers were subsistence farmers. Transportation. Cash crops, of course, depended upon markets, and markets require a movement of goods to get the products there, transportation. And so the American farmer, as he becomes more and more dependent upon cash crops, is also dependent upon a development of the transportation system. By 1821, some 4,000 miles of roads. Here's a picture of the building of the National Road. So 4,000 miles of roads had been completed by the 1820s. Westbound traffic moved along several roads to the so-called National Road in southeastern Pennsylvania, and then west to Vandalia, Illinois. Once overland traffic reached the Ohio River, they could float westward on huge flatboats. By the 1820s, about 3,000 flatboats went down the Ohio River into the Mississippi River, and they carried not only passengers on occasion, but primarily the great products of this grain belt of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and so forth. By the early 1820s, the turnpike is another word for road, the turnpike craze was giving way to more efficient transportation, the river steamboat and the canal barge. In 1807, again, more technology, transportation, and change. In 1807, Robert Fulton sent his improved version of the steamboat up the Hudson River. Here is a mechanically driven boat, the steamboat, not dependent upon the current, not dependent upon sail or the wind. And this inaugurates, this Fulton steamboat going up the Hudson River, inaugurates the steamboat era in American transportation. And it's going to open up the continent to trade and to travel. By 1836, steamboats navigated the western waters. Lecture at this point. By 1836, steamboats navigated the western waters, reaching further up the tributaries of the mighty Mississippi. In the 1840s, shallow draft steamboats on the rivers now, dependent upon being able to go over shallow water areas, so they can't displace a great deal of water. They have to be shallow draft. These steamboats moved ever further and further upstream. And some of the riverboat men would exaggerate. Of course, exaggeration is a human trait, but arguing that these steamboats could navigate a heavy dew. Of course, the miracle of these floating palaces became one of the romantic epics of American life. One writer described them. They were fairy structures of oriental gorgeousness. Of gorgeousness and splendor, rushing down the Mississippi or plowing up between the emerald forest, bearing speculators, merchants, dandies, gamblers, and fine ladies. They carried pianos, novels, cards and dice, and featured flirting, dancing, drinking, lovemaking. A steamboat brings to our remotest villages on the rivers, to our very cabin doors, a little of Paris or New Orleans. Eventually, the steamboat, by enabling reliable two-way traffic, would replace the drifting flatboats. The Mississippi Valley became the breadbasket of America and frankly, a good portion of the world, as the grains and produce of the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley are sent down to the port of New Orleans at the very base of the Caribbean, very base of the mouth of the Mississippi River. And then from there, ocean-going shipping takes these products to the world. So New Orleans in the 1830s was our leading port. But New Orleans is going to get competition. In 1825, the Erie Canal connected Lake Erie to the Hudson River. Now, the Hudson flows north and south, and the Hudson River is what flows by New York City on its western side. And so if you connect the Lake Erie through the Erie Canal to the Hudson River, then you're going to have access to the Atlantic Ocean from well into the interior of the country, from western New York and the adjoining areas. So the Erie Canal is completed in 1825. And now this canal and then the connection to the Hudson River begins to siphon trade away from the Ohio and Mississippi. So linking the West more with the East. The success of the Erie Canal, and it is enormously successful, began a decade of canal construction, which only ended with the financial panic of 1837. And if you recall, the financial panic of 1837 is brought on by Andrew Jackson's attempt, or actually his killing of the Bank of the United States. With the enhanced ties created by transportation between the Northeast and the Northwest, these regions grew closer and closer together. And the South, to some extent now, becomes a little bit more isolated. Meanwhile, railroads were gaining on the canal and the steamboat business and would someday absolutely dwarf canals and steamboats in terms of significance. By 1825, eastern cities, especially those without an inland waterway, were salivating at the prospects of a newfangled railroad. Baltimore got the jump on many of the other cities in the country when it began construction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Some of you are familiar with the old B&O because the Baltimore and Ohio is on your Monopoly game board. From 1840 to the eve of the Civil War, railroads increased in mileage 10 times to 30,000 miles. And the vast majority of this mileage on railroads is in the north, connecting the cities, factories, and such of the north. In 1860, there was only one railroad in the south that connected the Mississippi to the east coast. There were several that did this in the north. And of course, getting produce to the port cities meant nothing without efficient ocean transportation. You've got to then take those products and ship them all over the world. And in the early 19th century, shipping lines began keeping regular schedules so that shippers and passengers, for that matter, could depend upon the ocean-going ships. In 1845, the majestic American clipper ships were introduced. Built for speed, the clippers were the 19th century's version of air transport. They were twice as fast as traditional ships. The clippers took American products overseas and returned with Chinese teas and silk and other luxuries as well as necessities. American clipper ships. Look how majestic that ship is. The role of government. The massive internal improvements of the era were the product of both state government and private initiatives, a combination of private enterprise and government initiatives. States invested in highway companies and even more so in canals. Private companies often combined with states to build canals and roads, again, a team effort. Railroads were largely the domain of private companies, where money was raised for a railroad back on Wall Street in New York. But these railroads often received land grants, a place to build the railroad, land grants then from the states or even the federal government. Federal government, as I just suggested, helped build this transportation network. Despite the constitutional scruples of some public officials, remember the Maysville Road controversy from the last lecture. The government oftentimes bought stock in some transportation companies and again provided land grants for railroads. The great transcontinental railroads that would go across the West and terminate on the Pacific coast would be largely land grant. That is, the federal government provided the land for these railroads. And then the railroads, having this land, would then sell the land to pioneers to build farms and ranches so that the railroad then could take their produce to market. That's how the system worked. In 1850, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, one of the most important figures of the mid-19th century American political scene, prevailed upon Congress to provide a land grant in order to build a north-south railroad, a railroad from Chicago to Mobile, Alabama. At the time, this land grant was considered a special case, but it became the precedent, as I just alluded to, for the land grants that would help build the transcontinental railroads in the 1860s. The Industrial Revolution. While the West and South were developing their agricultural economies and transportation systems, the Northeast was laying the foundation for an industrial revolution, a change from a largely agricultural economy to an industrial economy that will take on in the United States in this period. Innovations in technology, of course, were about to give rise to a new form of production, the factory. At the end of the colonial period, manufacturing remained in the household or handicraft stage. Craftsmen either worked in small shops or paid workers to produce products, shirts, shoes, what have you, in their homes. Ironically, it was Thomas Jefferson's embargo of 1807-1809 which stimulated the growth of American industry. Jefferson, in an effort to stay out of war with Great Britain, kept American ships at home. Since there's no trade going on, Americans now begin to rely upon themselves to produce products that they had previously bought from Europeans. The War of 1812, which came along a little bit later, only increased this propensity for self-reliance. Conflict with England provided the need, as I've just alluded to. Oliver Evans provided the means. In 1804, Evans produced a high-pressure steam engine, which could be used in factories to power machines. So that steam engine, which was used, of course, for movement of goods on railroads and on steamboats eventually, the same kind of technology is going to be modified and used in factories to run the machines. The first American factory was built in Massachusetts in 1813 by the Boston Manufacturing Company. By 1850, and a generation later, Massachusetts now was the home of a full-blown textile manufacturing industry. Textile is the word for cloth. So if you've got a textile industry, you are producing cloth, which then, of course, is used to make clothing. And this textile industry is quickly transferring itself to steam power based. During the 1830s, as the cost of textiles dropped, or producing more and more, prices are dropping. It's a good thing for the person who wants to purchase clothing, but it's a bad thing for the factory owners and so forth, and perhaps for the workers. So as the cost of textiles drops, so do the wages in these factories. Relations between workers and managers deteriorated. Labor unrest became quite common. There was a growing similarity between American factories now and those English factories described in Charles Dickens' Hard Times. And of course, hopefully you know that Dickens, writing in the mid-19th century in England, was harshly critical of the situation, the conditions, the social conditions in England's industrial economy. Moreover, as Northerners criticized Southern slavery, and rightfully so, Southerners responded with a criticism of Northern wage slavery, and again, rightfully so. Summary. In the years from 1820 to 1860, the United States had moved from a subsistence farming economy to a market farming economy. The key to this development was the construction of an efficient transportation system. Now, the next step is the industrial economy, but we're not quite there yet in the middle of the 19th century, in the era before the Civil War. But industrialism is coming, as we've already seen, but there is a definite transition from a subsistence farming economy to a market farming economy. And the country had made huge strides towards industrialization, especially in the northeastern part of the nation. So we're on the verge of the industrial age, not quite there yet. The coming of the Civil War would launch the United States unalterably upon that industrial course. Well,